Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into something pretty complex today. Wendy Brown's Finding the Man in the State.
Oh, yeah, this one is a classic. So thought-provoking.
It really is. And, the title itself kind of throws you off, right? Like, Finding the Man in the State. What does that even mean?
Right, it sounds almost like a joke, but it gets at something really profound. This idea that even though we often see the state as this protector, especially for women.
Right, like providing things like welfare or protection from violence.
Exactly. Brown's saying, well, hang on a second. Is it really that simple? Or could the state actually be perpetuating male dominance in ways we don't even realize?
Okay, yeah. I'm starting to see where this is going. So it's not just about laws that discriminate against women. It's something deeper.
Way deeper. Brown's looking at all sorts of state powers, from the capitalist system to even, how bureaucracy works.
Bureaucracy. Really? I wouldn't have thought of that.
It's fascinating, trust me. She uncovers all these surprising historical connections, too, like how the origins of the state itself are intertwined with male dominance.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So where do we even begin with this?
Well, Brown starts by pointing out something that's been happening more and more. Women relying on the state for survival, for things like welfare,
Yeah, more and more women are heading households, raising kids on their own.
Exactly. And that raises a huge question. Does this dependence on the state actually empower women? Or could it be, reinforcing the very power structures it's supposed to dismantle?
I see what you mean. Like, okay, a woman is on welfare. She's not dependent on a husband, but now she's dependent on the system.
Right. And who created that system? Who designed it? Who runs it?
Men, for the most part, right? Historically, at least. So is she really free?
That's the question Brown's asking. And to really get into it, she breaks down state power into these 4 dimensions, like a way of dissecting it, to see how male dominance might be woven into the very fabric of how the state works.
4 dimensions. Okay, break it down for me. What's the first one?
All right, so we've got the liberal state. Now, the liberal state, it's all about individual rights, equality for all. Sounds good on the surface.
Sure. I mean, who doesn't love equality?
But it gets tricky when you apply it to women's lives. Because the liberal state also has this strong emphasis on separating the public and private sphere.
Okay, what does that even mean?
So it's like saying, okay, women, you handle the home, the family, the private stuff, and men, you handle the public stuff. Politics, the economy,
So women are relegated to this private sphere that's not really seen as important.
Exactly. It's like saying women's concerns, especially those related to family and caregiving, they don't really matter in the real world.
And when women do try to enter the public sphere, to work or participate in politics,
they're often forced to do it on men's terms.
So they have to kind of leave behind or deny those parts of their experience that don't fit the liberal ideal.
You got it. And that leads us to the second dimension, the capitalist state. Think about it. Capitalism, it's all about work, the economy, making money.
And haven't women historically been disadvantaged in the economic sphere?
Big time. And the capitalist state often reinforces that. Think about all the unpaid care work women are expected to do. Raising children, looking after family members, keeping the household running.
Yeah, and that's on top of often having to work low-paying jobs.
Right. Or being pushed out of the workforce altogether because of, a lack of affordable childcare.
It's like this double whammy, making it really hard for women to be economically independent.
And Brown's argument is that this keeps women dependent, whether it's on individual men or a state system that doesn't really value their labor. Now, are you ready for the third dimension? Things get a bit more intense here.
Okay, lay it on me. What's next?
The prerogative state. This is where we see the state flexing its muscles, so to speak.
Oh, I get it. This is about the state's power to, use force, right? The police, the military, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Think about it. The state has the power to act arbitrarily, to use violence or the threat of violence, both domestically and internationally. And Brown draws this chilling connection between male violence and the very origins of state power. It's a bit unsettling, but she makes a compelling case.
It makes you think, right?
Right.
Like the state's role as protector, it can sometimes reinforce this idea that women need protection from, a world dominated by male violence.
Yeah, it's like a paradox. Like the very act of protecting can actually perpetuate the power imbalance it's trying to address.
Okay, I'm processing that one. So what's the final dimension?
The bureaucratic state. This one might seem less dramatic than the prerogative state, but trust me, it's just as important. We all know the feeling, right?
Oh, yeah, bureaucracy. Paperwork, red tape, getting lost in the system.
Exactly. And Brown's argument is that the whole language of bureaucracy, it often devalues what are considered female values. Things like caregiving, empathy, building relationships.
It's all about being objective, detached.
Right. And think about a woman navigating, say, the welfare system. She's up against these impersonal rules and procedures.
It don't take into account her individual circumstances or her needs.
Exactly. It can feel very dehumanizing. And that feeling of powerlessness, of dependence, well, it just reinforces the power dynamics Brown is talking about.
Okay, so we've got these 4 dimensions. The liberal, the capitalist, the prerogative, and the bureaucratic. Each operating in its own way, but all contributing to this, subtle presence of male dominance within the state.
You're getting it. It's like we're starting to see the man behind the curtain. But Brown takes it even further. She argues that the state itself is becoming a kind of new man, taking on roles traditionally associated with men, like the provider, the protector.
Well, that sounds like a good thing, right? The state stepping up to support women where men have failed.
Maybe, but Brown warns us that it might not be that straightforward. Like, the state could be perpetuating male dominance in new, more subtle ways while seeming to be a champion for women.
Kind of like those guys who claim to be feminists, but actually they still benefit from, the patriarchy.
Exactly. It makes you wonder, is simply shifting dependence from a man to the state really liberating? Or are we just trading one master for another?
Whoa, that's a big question.
And it's one we're going to dive into even deeper in the next part of our deep dives, so stay tuned. So, picking up where we left off, Brown's argument really gets you thinking about what freedom actually means.
Yeah, it's not as simple as just like, oh, I'm independent, I can do whatever I want.
Right. It's like, is it enough to just escape dependence on an individual man, like getting out of a bad relationship or becoming financially independent? Or is there something more to it?
It seems like Brown is getting at something bigger, right? Like, it's not just about individual choices, it's about the system itself.
Exactly. She's arguing that true freedom can't just be about escaping individual dependence. It's about dismantling those structures that create those dependencies in the first place.
So, okay, it's not enough to just, swap out dependence on a man for dependence on the state?
Nope. We have to actually look at the state itself and how its power dynamics can sometimes mirror those we see in personal relationships.
It's like those Russian nesting dolls. You open one and there's another one inside. You think you've gotten to the core, but there's always another layer.
That's such a good analogy, because it really shows how these power structures are embedded in everything. They're not just about individual bad actors. It's like they're woven into the fabric of society.
Okay, so then what does this mean for women, especially those who depend on the state, for support? Are they just doomed to be stuck in this cycle?
Well, Brown doesn't say that, but she does push us to be more critical, more discerning about how we interact with the state. We can't just assume that state intervention is automatically a good thing.
Especially when it comes to issues that specifically affect women.
Exactly. We need to be asking those tough questions, like who really benefits from these policies? Who gets left out? Are they actually reinforcing existing power imbalances instead of challenging them?
It's not enough to just look at the stated intentions of a policy. You have to look at the actual impact, right?
Absolutely. And that means being aware of the potential downsides of state power, particularly its tendency to regulate and control, often in ways that disproportionately affect women.
Like, remember that example we were talking about earlier with welfare?
Yeah. Welfare can provide a safety net, but it also comes with all these rules and regulations that can feel really controlling.
And a lot of those rules are based on these outdated assumptions about, women's roles.
Right. Think about things like, the hoops women have to jump through to prove paternity to receive child support.
Or the limits on how they can spend their welfare benefits. It's like they're being told, okay, we'll help you, but only if you behave in a certain way.
Exactly. And that brings us back to Brown's point about the importance of freedom as self-legislation. It's about having the power to make your own choices, shape your own life, not being told what to do.
But how do we even achieve that kind of freedom when we're talking about something as massive as the state? It can feel so overwhelming.
I know. It's definitely a challenge. Brown suggests that one of the first steps is awareness, recognizing those hidden ways in which state power operates.
So understanding the system.
Yeah. Learning how to navigate it, but also being willing to challenge it, to demand something better.
We can't just be passive. We have to be active participants in shaping it.
Exactly. And that's where collective action becomes so important. Brown points out how women's struggles for freedom have always been tied to the state in some way.
Through activism, protests, legal battles.
Right. It's about women coming together to disrupt those entrenched power dynamics, to make the state more responsive to their needs, to create a system that empowers rather than controls.
And it's not just about women working in isolation, right? It's about finding common ground with other movements fighting for social justice.
Yes. Recognizing that different forms of oppression, they're all interconnected, they reinforce each other.
So the fight for gender equality is also tied to the fight for racial justice, for economic equity. It's all connected.
Exactly. It's about creating a world where everyone, regardless of gender, race, class, has the opportunity to truly thrive. But then the question becomes, how do we actually get there? What are the concrete steps we can take to move towards that more just future?
And that's the question we're going to try to tackle in the final part of our deep dive. We'll explore some of the strategies that have actually worked in challenging state power, in pushing for real change. Okay, so we know we need to challenge the state and its, sometimes hidden forms of male dominance.
Right, but the question is how?
It can feel kind of overwhelming, to be honest. Like, where do you even begin to dismantle these massive systems?
It's true, and Brown doesn't give us, like, a step-by-step guide or anything, which I actually appreciate.
Yeah.
She's more about encouraging us to think critically, to come up with our own solutions, based on our own specific situations.
So it's like she gives us the tools, but then we have to figure out how to use them.
Yeah. Exactly. And one of the things she really emphasizes is that feminist engagement with the state, it has to be strategic. Yeah, like we can't just blindly appeal to the state for support or protection without thinking about, what might happen as a result.
Right, because the state itself is, in a way, a product of male dominance.
Right. Exactly. So it's almost like you have to be careful not to play into the very power structures you're trying to break down.
It's a delicate balancing act.
For sure. It requires us to be informed, organized, to really understand how the different dimensions of state power operate.
Right, the liberal, the capitalist, the prerogative, the bureaucratic.
All of them. How they intersect, how they can be used for good or for bad.
So are you saying we shouldn't reject the state outright?
No, it's not about that. It's about understanding its complexities, and finding ways to maybe use it as a tool for change while also holding it accountable for its flaws, its limitations.
Okay, I get it. It's a both hand kind of thing.
Exactly. And that might involve all sorts of strategies.
Like what?
Well, it could be legal challenges to discriminatory laws, or grassroots organizing to build power and influence policy.
Yeah. It could be working within state institutions to try and advocate for women's needs.
Oh, right. Like being on the inside, trying to change things.
Exactly. Or even creating alternative systems and structures that operate outside of the traditional state power altogether.
So there's no one right answer. It's all about context.
It's about being creative, resourceful and adaptable, recognizing that this fight for gender equality, it's a marathon, not a sprint.
It's a long game.
Yeah. And remember, it's not just about changing laws or policies.
Right.
It's about changing culture, challenging those really deep-seated norms and beliefs.
Creating a society that actually values women's experiences.
Yeah, where their voices are heard, where their contributions are respected.
So it's this multi-pronged approach, working on both the systemic level and the cultural level, right?
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that real change requires a fundamental shift in how we think about power, how we think about gender, how we think about freedom itself. And that brings us back to that question Brown asked, right? Are we truly becoming more free as we rely more and more on the state?
Right. Is it really freedom if you're just trading one form of dependence for another?
It's complicated, isn't it? There's no easy answer.
It all depends on how we engage with the state, how critically we examine its power, and how effectively we can use it as a tool for change.
So it's not about saying yes or no to the state. It's
about being constantly engaged, pushing the boundaries, demanding more, never settling.
Never giving up the fight.
Exactly.
Well, that about wraps up our deep dive into Wendy Brown's Finding the Man in the State. It's been quite a journey.
It has. Really makes you think.
It does. And, this is just the start of conversation. Right. We've just scratched the surface here.
Yeah. Brown gives us this amazing framework, but it's up to each of us to take these ideas and really apply them in our own lives, in our communities.
To keep asking these tough questions, to keep challenging the status quo.
And to keep pushing for a world where all women can be truly free.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. And until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep fighting the good fight.